And the first part is retrospective in the sense that it looks over my life and the people that I've been involved with. And I go back to my very early days in school when I did well in art and I did well in math. And I went to the headmaster of my school and I said, because I do well in art and I do well in math, I will study architecture. And he looked at me and said something that went right over my head. In fact, it took me 10 years to understand what he said. He said, I like gray suits and I like pinstriped suits, but I don't like gray pinstriped suits. And it completely escaped me. I went to architecture school, and I realized many years later that for me, the combination of art and technology was computers, not architecture. And so I looked now, more recently, back at my own career, the career of people who have been with me for the past 35, 40 years, and I asked myself, where do new ideas come from? And there are really four places, but the biggest is differences. They come from differences, and that is so important because a homogeneous society is not an innovative society. That's very important to remember. If you are a homogeneous society, it's much harder. And people look at the United States and say all the innovation or a lot of innovation is coming from there. It's because it's full of differences. It's a heterogeneous society. And the second ingredient is that there are all these unlikely juxtapositions. That things you don't expect to go together suddenly do. And one of the reasons that's important to remember is that our world, our schooling, our entire education system is based on likely juxtapositions, not the unlikely ones. And third of all, it's very important, and this is more for the corporate world, to keep looking outside. There's such a temptation to look inside, especially in a big corporation where you have half the people in the corporation managing the other half. And then the half who are being managed are spending half of their time being managed. So you end up in a big corporation with less than 25% of the net energy of humans to be innovative because everybody's managing or being managed. So it's very important to look outside and then to remember, last of all, that discipline is not your friend. Sometimes it takes very undisciplined, very chaotic environments for innovation to happen. And I'm going to share with you, to me, the most important piece of advice I can give to somebody in the room is that incrementalism is your enemy. Incrementalism, when somebody tells you go step by step, wrong. Incrementalism is not your friend. You have to look to the side. You have to do things that are, in fact, not incremental at all. So I'm going to give you an example, and I'm reaching back 40 years. This slide is 40 years old, this image. 40 years ago, I had, I don't want to call it a dream, I had a belief that the way people would interact with computers 40 years later would be by touching them. People thought that was stupid. So stupid that people wrote technical papers about how stupid it was to touch a computer. And one of these papers came up with very scientific reasons, except for the third one, which I'll mention in a moment, as to why it would be bad and it wouldn't work. One of the reasons was that if you used your fingers would block what you were touching. You couldn't see through your fingers. Another reason was that your fingers were very low resolution, and so you couldn't touch small things. And the third reason, which was the funniest, was that if you used your fingers, you would get the screen dirty. My reason for saying that is that many years later, it's one of the most common interface, and it is something that you just have to do, see, and guess what, touch. And people slowly, one of the first people to really buy into this was Steve Jobs. And I knew Steve very well, and he said, well, Nicholas, won't it get the screen dirty? And I said, no, Steve. It'll actually, if the screen is dirtier than your finger, it'll clean the screen.